But during this same dark time, two other men also sat in a corner of the world, not seeking absolute power, but trying to save their countries from the same crisis that drove others to dictatorship. In America, Franklin Roosevelt, a man paralyzed from the waist down, took over the leadership of a country struggling through the deepest economic crisis in its history. Instead of promising order through absolute power, he put forward a program called the New Deal, a program that wanted to prove that democracy could also be a savior in a crisis. In Britain, Winston Churchill, a politician who had been pushed to the margins of power for years and was rarely taken seriously, was vocal from the very beginning. There's something we need to understand. None of these leaders came to power from the start through a military coup. Most of them emerged from within the same democratic or semi-democratic systems that they later destroyed. The people of Germany, Italy, and Japan in those years saw democracy as weak, as disorderly, and as incapable of resolving crises. Parliaments were arguing, governments were collapsing, and in the meantime, ordinary people were starving. In this vacuum, the voices of men of power rose, promising to restore order, who said that democracy was weak, but a strong leader could save the nation. In Italy, this man was Benito Mussolini, the one who invented a new order called Fascism. In Germany, it was Adolf Hitler, the one who turned the anger and despair of his people into an ideology of hatred. In Russia, after a revolution and a bloody civil war, Joseph Stalin slowly but ruthlessly concentrated power in his own hands. And on the other side of the world, in Japan, the military, who ruled in the name of Emperor Hirohito, dreamed of an empire that would have to be built with blood. November 11, 1918, 11 o'clock in the morning. The guns fell silent. After 4 years of war that had killed more than 17 million people, a war they called the Great War, silence finally fell over Europe. People celebrated in the streets of Paris and London. They thought this was the end of all wars. They called it the war to end all wars. But they were wrong. What really happened that day was not the end of one war. It was the sowing of the seeds of the next war, a war that 20 years later would kill 70 million people. To understand how 5 men in 5 different countries were able to set the world on fire, we must go back to this moment, to a table in the suburbs of Paris, where the fate of the next generation was written. In the Palace of Versailles, the leaders of the victorious country sat around a table. France, Britain, America. They had to decide what to do with defeated Germany. France wanted to bring Germany to its knees forever. A country that had turned French soil into a battlefield for 2 generations had to be punished. Britain was more cautious, and America, with Woodrow Wilson, dreamed of a lasting peace. The result of this conflict was a treaty that satisfied no one completely, but angered everyone sufficiently. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. It was forced to pay reparations that crippled its economy for decades. Its lands were divided. Its army was reduced to 100,000 soldiers. And most importantly, the German people felt betrayed. They hadn't lost the war on their own soil. Their soldiers were still standing on the enemy's borders when the armistice was declared. So why should they be punished? This sense of injustice was what a defeated painter and former soldier later used to get his message across, a man named Adolf Hitler. Germany experienced the 1920s with inflation that economic history has rarely seen. Imagine, you buy a loaf of bread in the morning with a basket of money. That same evening, the same amount of money would not buy even a loaf of bread. People were carrying wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy groceries. Lifetime savings had been reduced to scrap paper in a few months. The German middle class, always the pillar of stability in society, was destroyed. And the people who had lost everything were looking for someone to blame, someone to give them hope, even if that hope was dangerous. In 1929, when the New York Stock Exchange crashed, the crisis spread throughout the world. The Great Depression closed the doors of factories all over the world. Unemployment reached millions in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, in America. People were confused and frightened, looking for a leader to save them from this situation. And it was here that the door was opened to men who, under normal circumstances, would never have come to power.
On April 20th, 1889, in a small village called Braunau, on the border between Austria and Germany, a baby was born, named Alois by his father, Adolf. Little did anyone know at the time that this baby would one day be associated with one of the darkest chapters in human history. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs officer, a strict, violent, and often alcoholic man. Historical accounts show that he treated his children, including Adolf, with severity and violence. His mother, Clara, by contrast, was a kind and overprotective woman, especially after losing her other 3 children at an early age. Adolf grew up in this house, between his father's violence and his mother's extreme love. At school, he was an average student. In some subjects, such as history and art, he showed great interest, but in many others he was undisciplined and uninterested. His dream in those years was to become a painter, not a politician, not a military commander, an artist.
The year 1907. With the dream of becoming a great painter, the young Hitler traveled to Vienna to enroll in the city's Academy of Fine Arts. He was rejected. The following year, he tried again. He was rejected again. This failure was a deep blow to the man who had built his entire identity around this dream. He spent the next few years in Vienna, poor and homeless, sometimes sleeping in homeless shelters, and supporting himself by selling small paintings and postcards that he painted himself. But Vienna also gave him something else in those years, what would later become one of the most dangerous ideologies in history. Vienna, at the time, was a city of ethnic and political tension. Local newspapers and politicians widely used racial and anti-Semitic theories. In the midst of his own poverty and disillusionment, the young Hitler absorbed these ideas that later became the mainstay of Nazi ideology.
The year was 1914. World War I began. For many, the war was a disaster. But for Adolf Hitler, who had been a man without a purpose, without a home, and defeated, it was something of a salvation. He eagerly enlisted in the Bavarian army, despite being an Austrian citizen, not a German. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of belonging. He felt part of something bigger than himself. He served as a messenger on the front lines of the Western Front, a job that was extremely dangerous. He was twice awarded medals for bravery, including the Iron Cross First Class, an honor that was unusual for an ordinary soldier. But in October 1918, just weeks before the end of the war, he was temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack. He was recovering in hospital when news reached him of Germany's surrender. Later, he wrote in his book that this was the moment of his soul's breaking. He saw the surrender as a betrayal by politicians, Jews, and socialists, not a real military defeat on the battlefield. This belief, although completely false, later became one of his most powerful propaganda tools, the legend of the betrayal in the back.
After the war, Hitler stayed in Munich and helped the German army as a political intelligence officer. His job was to identify extremist political groups. In this regard, in 1919, he went to a meeting of a small, unknown party called the German Workers' Party. At the time, the party had only a few dozen members and met in the back of a tavern. No one in that small room imagined that this marginal party would one day rule the fate of the world. Hitler joined the party and quickly became known for his extraordinary oratory skills. He could convey the anger, fear, and despair of the German people,
who were suffering from the defeat of the war, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, and the economic crisis, in his speeches. The crowd was captivated by his way of speaking. The party soon changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis for short.
The year is 1923. Germany is in a deeper crisis than ever. Inflation has risen to such an extent that money has become practically worthless. Hitler and his party saw this as an opportunity to seize power by force. On November 8th, Hitler and his entourage entered a large beer hall in Munich, where the Bavarian state government was meeting. He fired a shot into the ceiling, declaring that a national revolution had begun. The next day, he and his followers marched through the streets of Munich to overthrow the government. The police responded with machine gun fire. 16 of his followers were killed. Hitler himself fled, but was arrested 2 days later. The coup, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, was a complete failure.
But the trial that followed did something strange. Instead of defending himself, Hitler turned the trial into a political speech. He presented himself not as a traitor, but as a nationalist hero who only wanted to save Germany. The newspapers printed these speeches. The man who had been unknown until a few weeks earlier was now famous throughout Germany. He was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, and less than a year later, he was released. It was during this short time in prison that he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, a book in which he explained his racist, anti-Semitic, and expansionist ideology in great detail. A book that would become one of the most important documents for understanding his intentions years later, because he had written everything down in advance, so openly. Chapter 6. The Great Crisis, the Great Opportunity.
After his release from prison, Hitler rebuilt his party, this time not with the aim of a military coup, but with the aim of coming to power through the ballot box. For most of the 1920s, the Nazi Party remained a marginal party, with few seats in parliament. The German economy was relatively recovering, and the public had little interest in his extremist messages. But in 1929, everything changed. The crash of the American stock market triggered a global crisis that hit Germany, whose economy was dependent on American loans, hard. Unemployment reached millions. The streets of Germany were filled with people who had lost everything. And at this precise moment, Hitler's message, a message of anger, blame, and a promise of a return to national greatness, suddenly made sense. The Nazi Party, which had held only 12 seats in parliament in 1928, had become the largest party in Germany by 1932.
January 30, 1933. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging president of Germany, appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. One thing to understand is this: Hitler did not come to power through a coup. He came to power through a political coalition, parliamentary negotiations, and finally, a perfectly legal appointment. Many conservative German politicians thought they could use him as a temporary tool, someone popular but controllable. They were sorely mistaken. Just a month later, a suspicious fire broke out in the German parliament building. Hitler used the incident as an excuse to impose emergency laws that completely suspended civil liberties and arrested political opponents. In the following months, he removed all legal obstacles one by one. Other parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, and in August 1934, after Hindenburg's death, Hitler merged the offices of president and chancellor into a single role: Führer, the absolute leader of Germany. German democracy, wounded at Versailles and crushed by the economic crisis, was now completely destroyed. And in its place,
A dictatorship had emerged that was intent on reshaping not just Germany, but the entire world.
From his first days in power, Hitler began to ignore the military limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. He began to openly rebuild the German army. Armaments factories were reactivated, conscription was restored, and the German Air Force, officially banned, was secretly and then openly rebuilt. European countries, especially Britain and France, saw these actions but did not react decisively. The terrible memory of World War I was still alive, and no one wanted a new conflict. This policy, later known as the policy of appeasement, gave Hitler the time and space he needed to carry out his ambitious plans. In 1936, he reoccupied the Rhineland, which was supposed to remain civilian. In 1938, he annexed Austria to Germany, a country where he himself had once lived in poverty as a failed painter. No one in the world seriously opposed it.
Up until this point in the story, the world didn't see Hitler as a serious threat. Many Western politicians saw him as a man who simply wanted to return Germany to its pre-war status, not someone who planned to set the entire continent on fire. But meanwhile, in another corner of Europe, in London, a man whose voice had been ignored for years was watching these developments with growing concern. He had warned many times that Germany was rebuilding its military power and had been ignored many times. His name was Winston Churchill, a man whose story we will tell in full detail in the next parts of this series. But before that, we must turn to another man, a man who had walked a similar path years before Hitler, and in fact, became the model for many of Hitler's propaganda and political techniques. A man who dreamed of restoring the greatness of ancient Rome.
July 29, 1883. In the small village of Dovia, in the Romagna region of Italy, a child was born, whose father, Alessandro, named him after the famous Mexican revolutionary, Benito Juarez. The choice of name was not accidental. Mussolini's father was a rural blacksmith and at the same time a fiery socialist, a man who spent hours talking to his son about revolution, class justice, and the workers' struggle. His mother, Rosa, unlike him, was a religious and calm teacher. This strange combination, his father's revolutionary fire and his mother's religious discipline, turned young Benito into a rebellious and energetic child, a child who was expelled from school more than once for his violent behavior with his classmates. In one of these incidents, he attacked a classmate with a knife. This pattern of violence and restlessness was a shadow that followed him for the rest of his life.
In 1902, the young Mussolini immigrated to Switzerland to escape military service and also to find work. There, he became acquainted with a network of socialist and revolutionary intellectuals. He wrote articles for socialist newspapers, spoke at workers' rallies, and quickly became known as one of the most passionate voices of Italy's socialist youth. He was even imprisoned for a time, not once, but several times for his political activities. But these imprisonments, instead of scaring him, increased his reputation within socialist society. In 1912, he became editor of the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, a newspaper called Avanti, Forward. This was one of the most important media positions in the whole of Italian leftism. At the age of 30, Mussolini had become one of the most powerful socialist voices in Europe. No one at the time could have imagined that this man, just a few years later, would become one of the greatest enemies of the very movement that had created him.
1914. World War I begins. The Italian Socialist Party, like many socialist parties in Europe, was opposed to the war. They saw it as a battle between capitalists in different countries who were sending workers to kill each other, a war that did not benefit the working class. Mussolini at first supported this policy. But something changed in him. He gradually came to believe that Italy should enter the war, not for the interests of capitalists, but for the sake of nationalism. He began to write articles advocating for Italy to enter the war. This change of position was disastrous. The Socialist Party, whose opposition to war was one of its founding principles, expelled him from the party for this betrayal of its ideals. A man who, until a few months earlier, had been one of the most important figures in Italian socialism, suddenly found himself outside the movement around which he had built his entire identity. But Mussolini, instead of a failure, saw this as an opportunity. He founded his own newspaper, Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy, and began to build a new political base for himself, one that was neither socialist nor strictly nationalist, but a strange combination of both. He himself went to war and served as a corporal, until in 1918, in a grenade explosion exercise, he was seriously injured and exempted from military service.
There is a strange thing about Italy after the First World War. Italy was on the winning side of the war, but at home there was a general sense of defeat and humiliation. Why? Italy had entered the war with promises of vast territories from its allies, Britain and France. But at the Versailles Peace Conference, many of these promises were not kept. Italy felt that despite paying a heavy price for the war, losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, it had not been given the rewards it deserved. This feeling, later known as the incomplete victory, was the breeding ground for a growing sense of angry nationalism in Italy. In addition, Italy's post-war economy was in dire straits. High inflation, widespread unemployment, and numerous labor strikes were dragging the country into chaos. Factories were being occupied, farmland was being seized by peasants, and the middle class and business owners were terrified of the chaos. They were looking for someone who could restore order, even if that order had to be achieved by force.
In March 1919, Mussolini formed a group he called the Fasci di Combattimento, which can be translated as fighting squads. The word fascio in Italian means squad or pack, a symbol of power through unity. The group was a strange mix of veterans of the war, angry nationalists, and those dissatisfied with the economic situation. They wore the same uniform, black shirts, and they used street violence as their main political tool. The black shirts attacked communists and socialists, the same people Mussolini had once been among. They burned down leftist newspaper offices, forcibly dissolved labor unions, and physically suppressed any dissent. Ironically, many industrialists, landowners, and even some in the government ignored this violence, or even supported it, because they thought the fascists were an obstacle to communist revolution. Mussolini, with the skill that would later become one of his hallmarks, presented himself to society not as a violent man, but as the savior of order and stability.
October 1922. Mussolini, now the leader of a well-organized fascist party, not just a violent street gang, decided it was time to seize power. He organized thousands of black shirts to march on Rome. The movement, which became known as the March on Rome, was a direct threat to the Italian government. Here's the surprising thing. The black shirts were not as well armed as the army. If the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, had ordered the army to confront them, the march would likely have been easily suppressed. But the king, fearing civil war and believing he could use Mussolini as a controllable political tool, decided not to confront him. Instead, he invited Mussolini to Rome and form a new government. Benito Mussolini, a man who only a few years earlier had been the editor of a French socialist newspaper, now arrived by train in Rome, not as a defendant, but as the new Italian chancellor. He was 39 years old, the youngest head of government in European history up to that point.
Initially, Mussolini was the leader of a coalition government, not an absolute dictator. But he quickly began to remove any obstacles to his absolute power. He passed a law in Parliament that gave the party that won the most votes a majority of seats. a law that effectively rigged the elections in the fascists' favor. Political opponents were silenced by violence, threats, or even murder. In 1924, Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist politician who had publicly accused the fascists of corruption and violence, was kidnapped and killed. Although there is no direct evidence linking Mussolini to the murder, most historians believe that it was carried out with his knowledge or indirect orders. Rather than weakening Mussolini, the incident paved the way for a complete crackdown. By 1926, all opposition parties were banned, freedom of the press was abolished, and Italy had officially become a one-party fascist state. Mussolini adopted a title for himself that would later become a model for other dictators, Il Duce, the leader.
Throughout his years in power, Mussolini had a grand dream: to restore the greatness of the ancient Roman Empire. He saw himself not just as a prime minister, but as the heir to an ancient civilization that should rule the Mediterranean once again. He began massive construction projects in Italy, roads, buildings, and Roman antiquities that were rebuilt or excavated to reinforce this historical connection. His government propaganda was full of images of Roman eagles and ancient symbols. But this dream was not merely symbolic. In 1935, he mobilized the Italian army to invade Ethiopia, one of the only remaining independent countries in Africa. The war, using chemical weapons against an army relatively well-equipped with conventional weapons, quickly ended in the conquest of Italy. The League of Nations, the international body that was supposed to stop such aggression, imposed only weak sanctions that had no real effect. This weakness was an important lesson for Mussolini, and later for Hitler, that the world was not prepared to seriously confront military aggression. The interesting thing about the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler is this. In the early years, Mussolini was Hitler's role model, and even, to some extent, his inspiration. In his early writings and speeches, Hitler openly praised Mussolini and his March on Rome as a model for his own movement. But during the 1930s, this relationship reversed. Germany, with its much stronger industry and army, quickly overtook Italy. Mussolini, who had initially been wary and suspicious of Hitler, he even mobilized his forces to defend Austria against Germany in 1934, gradually became a junior and dependent partner in the alliance. In 1936, during the Spanish Civil War, both dictators supported Franco's forces, and this cooperation became the basis for a more formal alliance. In 1939, the alliance was formally consolidated with a treaty called the Pact of Steel. Mussolini, a man who had once considered himself Hitler's role model, was now embarking on a path that would lead him completely into the shadow of his former student.
In his speeches, Mussolini portrayed Italy as a great military power. State propaganda presented the Italian army as a modern and fearsome force. But the reality was very different. The Italian army was years behind Germany in armaments, training, and leadership. Much of its equipment was old and inadequate. Italian industry lacked the capacity to support a long major war. However, Mussolini, enchanted by Hitler's early successes in Europe, decided to drag Italy into a war for which it was woefully unprepared. A war for which we will see his ultimate collapse and downfall in greater detail in later parts of this series. But before we get to that point, we must follow the story of another man. A man who had taken a very different but equally bloody path in Eastern Europe, in a country called Russia.
December 18, 1878, in the small town of Gori, in Georgia, part of the Russian Empire at the time, a child was born, who was named Iosif Jugashvili. The world, years later, would know him by another name, Stalin, meaning man of steel. His father, Besu, was an alcoholic and cruel cobbler. Numerous historical accounts indicate that he beat his mother and child constantly. The violence was so severe that neighbors were often forced to intervene. At the age of 7, little Joseph contracted smallpox, which left his face permanently scarred. Scars he would try to conceal in official photographs throughout his life, retouching them. His mother, Ekaterina, was a religious and determined woman who dreamed of her son becoming a priest. With great difficulty, she enrolled Joseph in an Orthodox religious school, a decision that would change the course of his life in ways no one could have imagined.
Joseph was a bright and well-read student at the religious school, but instead of producing a devout priest, this same repressive and strict religious environment led him to study forbidden literature and revolutionary ideas. He read Marx and other socialist theorists in secret libraries. At the age of 15, he joined an underground socialist group in Georgia. In 1899, he was expelled from the seminary for reasons that historians still debate. Some say for failing exams, others for his political activities. From then on, his life path changed completely. He became a professional underground activist. He helped organize labor strikes in the Baku oil fields, published underground publications, and was constantly pursued by the Tsarist secret police. It was during this time that he adopted several pseudonyms, until finally he settled on the one that would define his identity forever: Stalin.
A less discussed part of Stalin's life is his role in financing the revolutionary movement through illegal activities. He was involved in organizing several high-risk operations, including armed robberies of banks and money wagons to fund the Bolshevik Party. The most famous of these operations was the robbery of a money wagon in Tbilisi in 1907, which resulted in dozens of deaths and a large sum of money for the party coffers. Although direct evidence linking Stalin to this operation is limited, most historians believe that he played a key role in its planning and execution. During these years, he was repeatedly arrested and sent into exile in Siberia, a punishment that for many revolutionaries meant the end of their political activities. But Stalin repeatedly escaped from these exiles and returned to his underground activities. This period developed in him a character trait that remained for the rest of his life: infinite patience, a deep distrust of anyone, and the ability to plan long-term without showing any haste or excitement.
The year 1917, Russia, in the midst of World War I, was on the verge of complete collapse. Millions of Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded. The country's economy had collapsed. Hungry and angry people took to the streets of Petrograd to protest. In February of that year, these protests led to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government took its place, but it quickly proved incapable of resolving the country's deep-seated crises. In the vacuum, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, of which Stalin was a key member, seized the opportunity. In October of that year, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd in a relatively non-violent coup. But that was only the beginning. What followed was one of the bloodiest civil wars of the 20th century, a war between the Red Bolsheviks and the counter-revolutionary White forces, which left millions dead through direct combat, massacres, and widespread famine. Stalin played a crucial role during this civil war as a military commander and party organizer, a role that gave him valuable experience in crisis management and power control.
This has to be one of the most important chapters in this section, because it shows how Stalin, unlike his rivals, rose to power by downplaying his own importance. After the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, Lenin was seen as the undisputed leader of the party and the country. Among other Bolshevik leaders, people like Leon Trotsky
because of their military and intellectual abilities, were seen as Lenin's natural successors. Stalin, by comparison, seemed less brilliant. He was not a great orator, he was not a great theorist, but he had one special skill that others underestimated: an unparalleled ability in administrative and organizational matters, and an endless patience for gradually accumulating power through control of party structures. In 1922, he was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that at the time seemed bureaucratic and unimportant, but it gave him direct control over the appointment and dismissal of party members throughout the country. Stalin quietly began to place his loyalists in key positions, while his rivals, such as Trotsky, were preoccupied with ideological debates and underestimated the importance of this bureaucratic control. Lenin, in his final years, realized the danger Stalin posed. In a secret memorandum, later known as Lenin's Testament, he warned that Stalin had amassed too much power and might abuse it. He even suggested that Stalin be removed from office. But Lenin died in January 1924, before this warning could be acted upon.
After Lenin's death, a battle for his succession ensued. With an astonishing skill at coalition politics, Stalin first allied himself with some of his rivals to eliminate his most powerful enemy, Leon Trotsky. He expelled Trotsky from the party, then exiled him from the country. But that was not the end of the story. Stalin did not stop pursuing Trotsky, even after he had been exiled to Turkey and then Mexico. In 1940, Stalin's agents murdered Trotsky in Mexico City with an ice axe, a symbol that Stalin did not ignore any potential threat, even remotely. After eliminating Trotsky, Stalin went after his former allies, those who had helped him eliminate Trotsky. One by one, he removed them from power, accused them of treason, and in many cases, executed them. This pattern during the 1930s developed into one of the most terrifying periods in modern political history, the period known as the Great Purge.
From 1936 to 1938, Stalin launched a wave of political repression that history has called the Great Purge. This purge was not limited to former political rivals. Senior officers of the Red Army, including many of the most experienced and capable Soviet military commanders, were arrested and executed on charges of espionage or treason. This decision would later cost the Soviet military dearly when World War II broke out, as many of its most experienced commanders were no longer alive. But the scope of the purges extended even beyond the military and politics. Millions of ordinary citizens, peasants, workers, teachers, artists were arrested on trumped-up charges, executed, or sent to Siberian labor camps, known as the Gulag. Historians' estimates of the exact number of victims of this period vary, but most reliable sources put the figure anywhere from a few 100,000 to over 1 million people directly executed, and millions more who died in labor camps. The public atmosphere in the Soviet Union became one of absolute fear. People were afraid to talk to their neighbors, even their own family members, about political issues, because anyone could report to the secret police, and any report could mean arrest, execution, or exile.
Before the Great Purge, Stalin had implemented another policy, whose consequences were perhaps even more deadly: the forced collectivization of agriculture. In the early 1930s, Stalin decided that individual agriculture throughout the Soviet Union should be transformed into large collective farms. Peasants who owned private land and livestock, known as kulaks, were targeted as class enemies. Millions of them had their property confiscated,
and many were executed or exiled to Siberia. In Ukraine, this policy, combined with the forced and excessive harvesting of agricultural products by the central government, led to a terrible famine known as the Holodomor. It is estimated that between 1932 and 1933, between 3 and 5 million people died of starvation in Ukraine alone. Historical evidence shows that the Soviet government, despite being aware of the famine, not only did not take any action to help, but also continued to export grain and even blocked international aid. Many historians see this policy not simply as an economic failure, but as a deliberate attempt to suppress Ukrainian resistance.
Despite these tragedies, we must also understand a complex and unpleasant point. During this same period, the Soviet Union, under Stalin, experienced one of the fastest industrialization programs in human history. Through centralized 5-year plans, the Soviet Union, a country that had been largely agricultural and backward until a few decades earlier, became one of the world's greatest industrial powers. Huge steel mills, mines, and military equipment were built across the country. This industrialization came at a terrible human cost: forced labor, dangerous working conditions, and complete disregard for workers' welfare. But from a geopolitical perspective, it was a crucial factor that later allowed the Soviet Union to resist and ultimately win the German military offensive in World War II. This is one of the bitterest paradoxes of 20th century history. Policies that sacrificed millions of lives at the same time built an industrial base without which the outcome of World War II might have been very different.
By the late 1930s, Stalin had complete control over the Soviet Union. Control achieved through fear, repression, and endless patience. Unlike Hitler, who captured the world's attention with his shouts and excitement, and Mussolini, who impressed the world with his show and epic gestures, Stalin was a man who worked quietly and behind the scenes. He rarely appeared in public, rarely gave fiery speeches, and preferred that others underestimate his greater faults. In the closing years of the decade, while Hitler was rebuilding the German army and Mussolini was dreaming of a Roman Empire, Stalin was calculating his own options for dealing with the growing threat of Nazi Germany. He knew that Hitler had openly spoken in his writings of the dream of expanding Germany's living space eastward, that is, toward the Soviet territories. But Stalin, contrary to many expectations, decided to make a deal with this ideological enemy to buy time. This decision will play a pivotal and surprising role in the later parts of this series, when we reach the early years of World War II. But first, we must go across the Atlantic, to the man who, for years, was the only one on the fringes of British politics who consistently warned of the danger of these dictators, and no one listened to him. The story of Winston Churchill begins in the next section.
On November 30th, 1887, at Blenheim Palace, one of the largest and most luxurious stately homes in Britain, a child was born who was named Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. He belonged to an aristocratic and powerful family. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent conservative politician, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, was the daughter of an American millionaire. By all accounts, Winston seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. But the reality of his childhood was much different and more lonely. His father, a man busy with politics and society, paid almost no attention to his son. His mother, too, was busy with her own life in London's social circles. Little Winston spent most of his childhood in the care of nurses, especially a nurse named Elsie Everett, whose affection he later described in his memoirs as the only real source of warmth in his childhood. He was a mediocre or even weak student at school,
He failed many subjects, including mathematics. But in one area, he showed extraordinary ability: English and writing. His teachers later recalled that he had an uncanny ability to memorize long poems, an ability that later played a vital role in his historical lectures.
After unsuccessful attempts at entrance exams, the young Churchill eventually managed to enter the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, although initially in the less competitive cavalry course. After graduating, he served as an officer in the British Army in several places of conflict in the British Empire, including in India and in the Sudan, where he took part in one of the last great cavalry raids in British history. But his most interesting adventure came during the Boer War in South Africa. There, as a war correspondent, he was captured by Boer forces. Rather than accept his fate as a prisoner, he devised a daring escape plan, traveling hundreds of miles through enemy territory to safety. The escape made him a national hero in Britain. The newspapers published his story with great fanfare, and Winston Churchill, until then the only son of an aristocratic family, got his first taste of personal fame. He quickly used this fame to enter the world of politics. In 1900, Churchill was elected to Parliament at the age of just 25. In the following years, he experienced a rapid and brilliant rise in British politics. He rose to the top of the government, including that of Admiralty Secretary, a position that gave him control of the British Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world at the time. But in 1915, during the First World War, he made one of the biggest mistakes of his career. He was the mastermind behind the Gallipoli campaign, an attempt to land British and Allied forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, with the aim of opening a road to Russia and shortening the war. The campaign was a complete disaster. The Allied forces met fierce resistance from the Ottoman army, and after months of bloody fighting, they were forced to retreat completely, at a cost of over 250,000 Allied casualties. Churchill was held largely responsible for the disaster. He was forced to resign from the government, and his reputation plummeted, from that of a national hero to that of a reckless politician, responsible for a major military disaster. He himself described this period as the darkest period of his life. For a time, he even returned to the front lines in France, not as a politician, but as an ordinary officer, as if seeking a way to escape the shadow of defeat.
Despite the disaster of Gallipoli, Churchill, thanks to his real abilities in management and oratory, was able to return to politics smoothly. During the 1920s, he rose to various positions, including Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the most important positions in the British government. But even in this position, he made a decision that was later heavily criticized: Britain's return to the gold standard, with an exchange rate that many economists, including John Maynard Keynes, considered a huge mistake. This decision led to economic stagnation and widespread unemployment in British industry, especially in the export sector. During these years, Churchill was known as a politician whose political judgment, despite his impressive personal abilities, was often questioned. On many issues, including his opposition to Indian independence, he took positions that alienated him from much of the public and even from his own party. In 1929, when the Conservative Party lost power, Churchill no longer held a position in government. What followed was a period that historians call Churchill's desert years, a long period of political isolation that lasted into the next decade.
During the 1930s, as Hitler rose to power in Germany and openly rebuilt the German army, Churchill, from the back seats of the British Parliament, repeatedly warned. In numerous speeches, he spoke in meticulous detail, drawn from his own sources of information, including his connections with military officers and diplomats, about the speed of the rebuilding of the German Air Force and the growing danger of Nazism. But most British politicians, including the prime ministers of the time, ignored these warnings. Britain was still suffering from the terrible memories of the First World War. People and politicians alike were looking for any way to avoid another war, even if that way meant ignoring a real and growing danger. Churchill was portrayed as a warmonger, a pessimist, and even a danger to peace. The newspapers ridiculed him. His former colleagues distanced themselves from him. Even in his own party, many considered him unreliable and unstable, partly because of his past decisions, such as the Gallipoli disaster, and partly because of his extreme positions on other issues. He spent most of his time in these years at his home in Chartwell, where he was busy writing historical books, including a biography of his great-grandfather, the Duke of Marlborough. But even in this isolation, he never stopped sounding the alarm.
British prime ministers at the time, notably Neville Chamberlain, pursued a policy that became known as appeasement. This policy was based on the belief that a larger war could be avoided by making limited concessions to Hitler. A prominent example of this policy was the Munich Agreement of 1938. Chamberlain, along with France and Italy, agreed, without representatives from Czechoslovakia, that part of that country's territory, the Sudetenland, would be annexed to Germany, in the hope that this concession would be Hitler's last request. On his return to London, Chamberlain celebrated the agreement as "peace in our time." The crowd cheered him on. But Churchill, in Parliament, denounced the agreement in one of his most brilliant and bitterest speeches. He warned that Britain and France had a choice between war and disgrace. They had chosen disgrace, and they should know that they would have war. Less than a year later, Hitler, in complete disregard of the Munich Agreement, occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Churchill's prediction was horribly correct.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The war that Churchill had been warning about for years had finally begun. And despite a long period of political isolation and humiliation, now even his former rivals were forced to admit that he had been right all along. In the early days of the war, Chamberlain reinstated Churchill as Admiralty Secretary, the same position he had held in the First World War. The signal transmitted to the British Navy that day was a single sentence: "Winston is back." But the early months of the war were extremely frustrating for the Allies. This period became known as the Phony War, a period in which there was little direct fighting, but in the background, Germany was preparing for a larger attack. In April and May 1940, Germany invaded Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France in a series of lightning attacks. Chamberlain's government, which had been weak and hesitant in its handling of the crisis, lost the confidence of Parliament and the people. On May 10, 1940, the same day that Germany launched its major invasion of Western Europe, Chamberlain resigned. Winston Churchill, a man who had been dismissed for years as a pessimist and warmonger, was appointed Prime Minister of Britain.
Churchill took office at one of the darkest moments in British history. France was falling. The British Army was surrounded and facing total annihilation on the beaches of Dunkirk. The Dunkirk evacuation, which used hundreds of military and civilian ships to rescue more than 300,000 Allied soldiers from the French coast, was a military failure, but psychologically it became a symbol of resistance and survival. During this time, Churchill gave a series of speeches that later became among the most famous in world political history. He promised the British people not an easy victory, but blood, sweat, and tears. They would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and in the hills, he said, and never surrender. After the fall of France in June 1940, Britain was the only country in Western Europe still resisting Germany. In the summer and fall of that year, the German Air Force launched a massive air campaign against Britain, a campaign that became known as the Battle of Britain. Despite being severely outnumbered by Germany in terms of aircraft and manpower,
the RAF pilots were able to repel the attack, a victory that Churchill, in one of his most famous quotes, described as follows: "Never in the history of human conflict have so many men owed so much to so few." Throughout his political life, Churchill had been a staunch opponent of communism and Stalin himself. He had often spoken publicly about the danger of communist ideology. But in June 1941, when Germany, ignoring its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, attacked the country, Churchill decided without hesitation to accept the Soviet Union as an ally. In a radio address, he declared that anyone who fought Nazism was his ally, even if that ally was Stalin. He later described this decision with a sarcastic remark: "If Hitler had attacked hell, he would even have said something positive about Satan." This decision demonstrated one of Churchill's most important qualities, his ability to separate long-term ideological principles from the immediate practical necessities of survival. This pragmatism was to be demonstrated again in the months that followed, as he formed a close relationship with President Roosevelt.
Of all the characters in this series, Winston Churchill's story is perhaps the strangest. A man who spent much of his political life in defeat, humiliation, and isolation. One whose warnings were ignored for years. And one who, when most of the world was looking for the easiest way out of war, was the one voice that said with conviction that this path would only lead to greater disaster. But when that fateful moment arrived, when Britain stood alone against one of the most powerful military machines in history, this same man, this former pessimist and warmonger, was the only one who could hold a nation together and determined, through words, through determination, and through the toughness he had cultivated in isolation for years, against a seemingly invincible force. In the next installments of this series, we move on to a man on the other side of the Atlantic, grappling with a very different but equally difficult challenge. A man who had lost the ability to walk, but who still decided to lead his country through the deepest economic crisis in its history, and finally, into the inevitable war. The story of Franklin Roosevelt begins in the next installment.